Hello everyone, and thank you for joining our SCTG webinar this morning or afternoon depending on your coastal orientation. This is Anthony Raj speaking from the Educational and Community Supports Unit at the University of Oregon. It is my pleasure to be hosting the April SCTG webinar titled Preventing the Use of and Improving the Effectiveness of Tier 2 Interventions, presented by Dr. Bob Putnam. Dr. Putnam is Executive Vice President of Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports and Consultation. He oversees a team of school consultants who provide behavioral consultations to public schools in New England and across the country. He is an implementation partner with National Technical Center for PBIS. His research interests are in the use of school-wide function-based interventions to improve pro-social skills as well as behavioral support strategies with individuals with behavioral challenges. I know that you are all excited to be here, and I would like to encourage all of you to interact via the chat box. Just a quick reminder that if you are dialing in, to please mute your phone via the *6 key combo. With that, I'll hand over to Dr. Putnam.
Morning and good afternoon to all of you. I'm very excited to provide this webinar on Tier 2 interventions around improving the effectiveness and also some strategies to decrease the use of Tier 2 interventions. The first thing I'd like to do is to open up the poll, which would indicate who's on the webinar, so we could have a good idea in terms of the participants. And I'll keep talking as you fill that out. So this webinar is sponsored by the National Technical Assistance Center for Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports. This website has a lot of Tier 2 support materials, so it's a good reference for Tier 2. It's also sponsored by the Safe and Healthy Students Initiative, the School Climate Transformation Grants. So besides the National Technical Assistance Center website, there are a couple other resources that are free that are really useful for those of you who are implementing Tier 2. University of Missouri has a Tier 2 workbook that's very useful for problem solving around Tier 2, as well as the University of Connecticut has a Tier 2 workbook that would help support your efforts. So our goals today would be, what are the strategies to reduce the use of Tier 2 interventions? And I've got a couple of examples relative to that. What are the systems to improve Tier 2 interventions? And what data sources should we use to assist in improving Tier 2 interventions? And what are the overall ways to improve Tier 2 practices? So if we look at the strategies to reduce the use of Tier 2 interventions, that's in the area of Tier 1, which is both school-wide and class-wide. So the more effective our school-wide and class-wide interventions, the less number of students who need Tier 2 supports. So we really focus when we work with school on really developing their school-wide interventions and their class-wide interventions. And then I'll show you some examples of that. So you've all seen this triangle before, I'm sure. We're talking about Tier 2 secondary prevention interventions to prevent the use of Tier 3 interventions. Tier 1 would be to prevent to develop pro-social skills and also prevent the use of Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions. So traditionally, in terms of PBIS, we look at classifying students according to the number of office discipline referrals that would need either Tier 2 or Tier 3 supports. So traditionally, we've looked at in terms of those individuals who benefit at all individuals would benefit from primary prevention, but those individuals who only need tier 1 supports, 0 to 1 office discipline referrals, those individuals who we would suggest need tier 2 supports would have between 2 and 5 office discipline referrals, and those individuals that have 6 or more we would suggest need to have tier 3 interventions. If we look at it graphically, it's the group of students that is in the red oval. The students with 0 to 1 would be those students who are supported through tier 1 interventions, and the group in the oval would suggest they need tier 2 interventions, and the group to the right would be those students who need tier 3 interventions. So when we're looking at tier 2, and we're looking at overall outcomes that we're looking for, one is to improve pro-social skills, improve academic performance, decrease the need for tier 3 interventions. The data that we would look at tier 2 would be tier 2 treatment integrity data in terms of how well are we implementing tier 2 interventions. We would also look at in terms of student outcomes, particularly in the area of office discipline referrals, check and check out data, which we'll talk a little bit later on, as well as social skills data that we would look at as being reviewed by the tier 2 team. And the practices which we'll talk about would be such as check and check out, check and connect, student proactive mentoring, student self-management. Those are some of the tier 2 interventions that we would look at as practices. And then most importantly is do we have a system, which we'll talk about. Is that a system, do we have a tier 2 team? Does the tier 2 team look at data? Do they select in terms of what interventions the school would need to support the student population? Do they look at in terms of the data to see, in fact, whether the tier 2 interventions are making an impact in terms of student behavior and academic performance? So if we look at our poll, and Anthony, I'm not sure I can see, I guess I can see the poll. We have teachers, we have coaches, we have district administrators, and we have a number of other folks that basically fall in the category of other. So we have a pretty decent representation of individuals that are working in the area of tier 2. So if we look at what are the essential features of tier 2 interventions, they need to be continuously available. That is, we're not starting up an individualized intervention for the student, that we have interventions that are available for students so that they can immediately access the interventions. The suggestion would be that if students need tier 2 interventions, that they're able to access them within 48 hours if need be. So we need to have those interventions continuously available. There's a minimal time commitment required from teachers. Our suggestions would be that teachers spend no more than 10 minutes per day on a student in terms of tier 2. Our goal would be to even have less time that they're committed in terms of doing that. That the required skill sets can be easily learned, that since this stems from the school-wide expectations that the skills that the students need to have can be readily learned through either the check and check out or pro-social skills interventions. That they're aligned with school-wide expectations, and that all personnel are aware of the interventions, so that if we're looking at a school and we go in and ask the teacher what are the tier 2 interventions, he or she would be able to let us know what those interventions would be and what their roles would be within the process. Now, this would be consistently implemented with most students, that it wouldn't be necessarily individualized to each student, but it would be the practices would be implemented consistently across all students that receive those interventions. And most importantly, that it's matched to the function of the behavior. So the Tier 2 team would be, in the beginning, might just guess in terms of what the function of the behavior and place the student in the Tier 2 intervention, rather than necessarily doing some type of brief functional behavioral assessment. So there's a Tier 2 systems readiness checklist that's out there. Oftentimes we suggest to Tier 2 teams or people considering Tier 2 that they use this checklist. Checklist is up on PBIS.org, so this is freely available. And that the readiness for Tier 2, we're looking at that Tier 1's implemented fidelity, and I'll show you an example in terms of why we think that's important. The Tier 1 data is being reviewed and used with the Tier 1 teams to make database decisions around improving the overall behavioral climate and student pro-social behavior. That we have a principal and district commitment to Tier 2 in terms of resources, time. What's our plan to make the faculty aware? And do we have a plan in place to identify interventions? Let's do the second poll. In terms of your school or schools you're associated with, what's their level of Tier 1 fidelity? So that's great. Most people have Tier 1 fidelity, that they're at least 70% on what tool they're using. We have about 40% of the individuals have 90% Tier 1 fidelity, which is really, really excellent. One of the questions is Tier 1 implemented fidelity. Why do we think this is important? And when we look at the poll, it's great that we have most of the participants are at 78% or above. And if we look at in terms of the levels of or the types of tools that we would look at in terms of fidelity at Tier 1, is the tier 1 fidelity inventory that we need to have 70%. We have the school-wide evaluation tool, and I have an example that looks at that and looks at in terms of the number of individual students who received offered system referrals. We have the benchmarks of quality and the self-assessment tool as well. So here's an example in Central Illinois. Elementary and middle schools, they had 23 schools that met SET, which is an 80% fidelity. And you can see the differences in terms of the portion of students that would need that would need Tier 2 supports or Tier 3 supports. We took a typical middle school and had 300 students. We'd have about 30 students that would need in the schools that met SET. If we looked at in terms of starting it without the SET being met, which was 12 schools, you had about 60 students. So we think it's really important that we have good Tier 1 fidelity, because in most cases we see significant reductions in terms of office discipline referral. And then the other thing we look at is in terms of reducing the usage of Tier 2 is classrooms. And do we have good classroom practices in place? And we would suggest that you have good classroom practices in place, because that also would help reduce the number of students who need Tier 2 supports. So in those features of Tier 1 in classrooms, one is, do we have a teaching matrix for activities within the class setting, whole group, small group, individual group? Do we have clear expectations for those different settings? Do we routinely teach and reinforce classroom procedures? that is important in terms of practices within the classroom. We have at least a 5-to-1 ratio of positives to correctives. Do we use the classroom matrix to pre-correct and redirect? Do we have high opportunities to respond? And have we used continuum of strategies prior to delivering an in-class consequence? So let me provide another example. This is a teacher that we worked with that taught 2 English language arts classes in a middle school. She had some pretty significant problem behaviors. Somebody just came into the chat. You will have access to the slides. They will be up on PBIS.org within probably the next 48 hours. We provided some training and coaching to the teacher to support her class-wide behavior support. Our focus was really on praising, decreasing behavior correction. So we taught her ways to change practices and provided some graphical feedback for her around praising, decreasing behavior correction, and increasing proactive monitoring. Before we started, we looked at the data from September to February, and then after that, we provided. So this is before pre-consultation and coaching. And if you look at, she had 40 students in her class. About 27 were students in the 0 to 1 range. She had 12 students that we looked at office discipline referrals as a criteria for tier 2. She had 12 students that would meet that criteria, and she had 1 student who was a frequent flyer and had 7 or more through February. So if we look at it in terms of a triangle, 30% of her population would be suggested for tier 2 supports. It's just much too many in terms of having a teacher monitor tier 2 supports. So that's why we really looked at in terms of developing better classroom practices. In her initial, some of the data we had, her praising and her behavior correction was 1 to 3.5. We're looking at 5 to 1. And she had some proactive monitoring where basically she was able to move around the classroom and in a lot of cases provided corrections rather than necessarily provided praise. So after coaching and a little bit of consultation, the praise to behavior correction changed from 1 to 3 to 1.4 to 1. It's not there to 5 to 1, but it's certainly an improvement from where she was, and the proactive monitoring doubled. So this is what I remember. This is what it looked like before. This is what it looked like afterwards. So you can see the difference in terms of really having good classroom practices in terms of the need for tier 2 supports, which is why we really suggest that you look at your classroom data, office disciplinary data, and providing appropriate classroom support so that you can avoid the need of tier 2 supports. If you look at this is before, this is a triangle afterwards, so that she had 1 student that needed tier 2 supports. The rest of the students did very well with universal supports. So that's why we think both the school-wide and the class-wide interventions are really important before you begin tier 2 or as you do tier 2 to reduce the number of students who need those types of supports. So a good resource if you're looking at in terms of classroom strategies is a document by Brandy Simon and a number of folks that's up on the PBIS.org site. If you want to have more information, and her book is excellent in terms of class-wide positive behavior supports as well. So what we really want to have is 85% or more of the students in the 0 to 1 range. That's what we're looking for. So the first thing we want to look at in terms of has the right tier 2 behavior systems team members been identified? In the most important members on the team is that we have someone with behavioral expertise that would serve in the Tier 2 team. And then we have someone with administrative authority as well. And then we need to have representation of folks that know the students and is familiar with school operations and policy. We expect the Tier 2 systems team to meet at least monthly. As agenda, we'll have agenda in minutes, clearly defined roles in terms of who the data analyst would be, who the facilitator might be, who the Tier 2 coach might be, so that you can have an effective Tier 2 team. The team should engage in action planning based on the data. So one of the goals is, do we have the most appropriate Tier 2 team? And that the Tier 2 team is responsible for providing data to the classroom teachers, really looks at in terms of developing the interventions that would be used within the school based on the school population. They would look at in terms of matching student need with the appropriate targeted interventions. And they would really look at in terms of what's the effectiveness of the overall Tier 2 interventions, as well as the effectiveness of the Tier 2 interventions on individual students. So that Tier 2 team really is a database team that really needs to work off of the data that they collect, both in terms of integrity and student outcomes, to develop an effective Tier 2 intervention. So are the right students being identified? We look at in terms of who should be involved in Tier 2. It would be those with low-level problem behavior. So if students have serious or violent behaviors, it wouldn't be really appropriate. We would look at them needing Tier 3 supports. That we're looking at low-level behavior, not severe. That if we're going to use our office discipline referrals as our screening tool, that they have between 2 and 5 referrals. We would also suggest that the Tier 2 team look at some screening data, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So those that potentially might be referred to the Tier 2 team that will probably need to have Tier 3 supports would be with those with extreme chronic behaviors or serious or violent behaviors or infractions. So Tier 2 will not be enough for those students who exhibit the most serious behaviors. So if we're looking at in terms of making sure our Tier 2 interventions are effective, we need to make sure that the students that are involved are appropriate for Tier 2 interventions. So here's an example of a Tier 2 teacher nomination form to begin to identify those students that would be most appropriate. It goes through in terms of looking at both internalizers and externalizers. It really allows for early identification, and the earlier we can identify these students from the beginning of the year that need to have Tier 2 interventions, the more effective we're going to be. So in terms of identify students for Tier 2 screening, one, we'd want to make sure we're screening for internalizers. The screening should be brief, easy, accessible. That we'd want to screen 3 times a year or when trying to make Tier 2 decisions. And there's strengths and difficulties questionnaire is a free questionnaire that you can use in terms of screening for Tier 2. And this is I'm not trying to sell books here, but this is a great reference in terms of looking at Tier 2 screenings and screening instruments, both those that are free and those that you'd have to pay for. Also, the social skills improvement system has a screening tool and has an individual social skills assessment that in some cases, if we're looking at in terms of Tier 2 interventions, we might want to look at the completing the rating system tool to identify what specific skills we want to work on. So if we look at those that have moved on to Tier 2, what's your level of fidelity at this point in time? So we have a range from those that are just starting, which are about 30%, to those that basically have 70% fidelity measures, which is pretty good in terms of tier 2. That's really terrific. So any questions? If you want to put questions in the chat box. Okay, we'll keep moving along. So what are the overall ways to improve tier 2 practices? Let's take a look at. The common tier 2 interventions are check-in, check-out, also called the behavior education program. There's also check-in-connect student engagement model. Social skills groups that would be varied in terms of function. From those that are looking at in terms of addressing motivation of students in terms of accessing adult attention or accessing peer attention or escape motivated behavior. We would want to have the social skills groups to be able to really address those things as issues that students would need, skills they would need in terms of functioning in their academic environment. So there's a study done with Umbright et al. That looked at in terms of matching the intervention with function. If you can see, the standard check-in, check-out would be used primarily for individuals that need adult attention. Social skills groups we would look at in terms of those particular groups addressing the main functions of the behavior. Check-in, check-out, check-in, connect covers all of the functions. We're looking at academic accommodations in academic instructional groups. We would look at that primarily around escape or avoidance task or activity. So it's important that we look at in terms of selecting interventions that are going to match with the students' function of their behavior, their motivation, or if we look at in terms of the whole school, do we have particular groups that are accessible to students who need to have work in terms of developing those particular skills. So we need to make sure that the intervention is matched to the function of the behavior. So one way to do that is to conduct a brief FBA. So we're sure that, in fact, the interventions that we're placing a student in that tier 2 match the function of the behavior. The facts, which is another tool that you can access in terms of PBIS.org, is a great tool to conduct a very brief FBA that would allow us to try to identify in terms of what the function of the behavior would be, and that we would have a better match and therefore probably more effective interventions, given that we know what the function of the behavior is. So in check and check out, if we look at in terms of the research, the students most likely to benefit would be those with low-level disruptive behavior, who particularly enjoy adult attention. This can be modified for escape-motivated behavior as well. If we identify the function of the behavior as escape-motivated, that we would want to add an academic component to the check-in, check-out. We also can modify it to serve those students who internalizes rather than just externalizes. Another thing we could look at doing would be in terms of doing a reinforcement preference assessment to ensure whatever reinforcers that we're using are actually reinforcers and that they're potent reinforcers. So if the students that we work with or the teams that we work with are having difficulty in terms of responsiveness, one of the things we want to look at in terms of assessing students' preference, so that we can make sure that the items that we're using for reinforcers are truly reinforcers for the students that we're serving. So that's another way that we would look at in terms of improving the effectiveness in terms of Tier 2. And other ways we can look at in terms of improving effectiveness would be adding more frequent feedback on a daily basis or at the end of the school day. You could break up the school day into 2 periods and provide more frequent feedback for students that are involved in your Tier 2 interventions. Or we can individualize the check-in, check-out to have the student select an adult who would be who he would like to meet with, or alternative ways to contact the adult will monitor his and her progress. So we can change the adult that the student interacts with, and we've seen that in some cases that has made a huge difference in terms of the student's participation in terms of check-in, check-out. Or we can look at in terms of individualizing the feedback procedure for those students with peer attention as their function. So we would look at in terms of could they spend time with a friend, a brief free time with a friend at the end of the day or the end of class, but the goal would be to provide more access to peer reinforcement, particularly with a preferred peer. And in terms of social skills, one of the ways we've looked at in terms of potentially of increasing the effectiveness of social skills interventions is making sure we've done these assessment ahead of time. So one would be to do an FBA using that fax. The other would be to do an assessment with one of the rating scales, such as the social skills intervention system. That would really allow us to target the skills that need to be targeted in terms of a social skills intervention. What we've seen, if you look at the meta-analysis of social skills interventions, one of the reasons that they don't work is there wasn't an assessment ahead of time to indicate what skills we really should be working on, either from a functional or motivational perspective, or from a topographical perspective. So those 2 types of instruments would be really helpful in terms of really pinning down what the social skills would be. And they're also useful, particularly the social skills intervention system as a rating scale, as a progress monitoring tool that you can use on like an 8-week basis or on a quarterly basis to look at in terms of have the social skills improved. So if we're saying the systems are all in place, but the students are not responding to the tier interventions, what other things could we do? Well, one would be assess fidelity of implementation both across the interventions, as well as if we're looking at individual students, we might want to look at fidelity of implementation, make sure that that the Tier 2 interventions are being implemented the way we would like to have them implemented. You look at the research in terms of check-in, check-out, about 60 to 75% of students will show a positive response if it's implemented with treatment integrity. So treatment integrity with the individual interventions would be another way to look at in terms of how do we improve our Tier 2 interventions. I'm going to skip over this. Right. And so there's a great treatment fidelity tool on check-in, check-out at the PBIS Maryland.org site that looks at in terms of coming up with ways of checking in terms of whether check-in, check-out has been implemented with good fidelity. It lists in terms of the items that in fact would be important to check on to make sure that we have fidelity with the individual intervention, rather than just fidelity with Tier 2. So if we look at the social skills interventions in terms of checking integrity, there's a link to school-wide skills and behaviors as really the instructive and trained to teach, because what we're really looking at is skill building in terms of these particular skills, and sometimes people set up groups and they end up to be talk groups. The goal would be this social skills really targeting those items that they need to have. And does the instructor have lesson plans that addresses those particular issues? And self-monitoring, which is another one of the tier 2 interventions, as clearly the target behavior had been identified and defined. The student has clear directions in terms of what he or she will self-monitor. Usually when we look at teaching self-monitoring, we're looking at first the adult monitor the behavior, then we're looking at the student will match their particular assessment of their own skills with the adult, so we get treatment integrity in terms of matching in terms of what we want the student to monitor at what particular level and in what particular types of behavior. Another way we've looked at in terms of improving tier 2 interventions is really looking at your data. That you look at in terms of analyzing the daily progress report to really identify patterns across both behavioral expectations as well as the time of day. So using that data as diagnostic information to go and look at in terms of how we can, where and when we want to improve the tier 2 interventions, whether it's additional kind of check-ins, whether it's changing in terms of reinforcers. So that we would want to look at in terms of modifying the information based on the data, and the tier 2 team would help in terms of organizing that information to help suggest in terms of modifications with the interventions. So for example, this is a check-in, check-out daily progress report for Daniel, and you can see here that he has real problems with period 4. Now, is that just an anomaly, or is it some consistent pattern? We look at the following day, we have a similar pattern that's the lowest scoring area that he has. If we look at the following day after that, it's the same pattern. So one of the things we would want to look at in terms of the effectiveness of the check-in, check-out, or if we're using check-in, check-out data to look at our social skills interventions, would be period 4. What can we do in period 4 that would improve what's going on? And is it the teacher or is it the subject matter? So we've done analysis before in terms of with individual kids with a tool that's in the O'Neill Story and Horner book that allows us to look at period 4, look at periods across the day, and allows us to look at in terms of the student rating themselves in terms of the difficulty of the subject or the difficulty of the class, meaning in terms of kind of the social aspects of the class, and that helps us in terms of trying to figure out diagnostically in terms of where do we want to make changes in our interventions. So here it's period 4. That's the challenge. Is this math class or language arts class, or which class is this? And we can try to see if we can do some observations in that particular class, so that we can make some changes. And it may end up being that we need to have some better classroom management practices that need to be put in place. So it may be student needs more academic support given this particular subject area, but we use our data to be able to make some decisions along those lines. Or on the other thing, we have, in terms of using our check-in, check-out data, a student who never actually contacts reinforcement because they've never met the goal. As you can see in this particular case, this particular student has never actually met the goal and contacted reinforcement. So one of the things we would need to do is look at how do we change the goal to have the student come in contact with reinforcement. So if we look at this, we have a goal of 80%, and you can see that the students never got to that. So one of the things we'd want to look at is, can we reduce the goal? So the question is, what would be a reasonable goal for Samantha at this particular point in time? We would suggest 45%, because if you look at in terms of her data, that there are a number of times where she's exceeded 45%. There's a number of times that she hasn't, so she would definitely contact reinforcement if, in fact, the goal is reduced, and then gradually over time that the goal be increased. So in terms of lessons learned, what we've found, and you may have similar suggestions if you want to make some suggestions in the chat box, that would be great, because we do have time for questions. The effectiveness in the ways to basically prevent the need for Tier 2 interventions really is dependent upon the high quality implementation of Tier 1 school-wide interventions, that we have good classroom implementation of Tier 1, so we can overall reduce the number of Tier 2 interventions that are needed to support our students, that we look at in terms of that the interventions actually be implemented with integrity. What we found in terms of a lot of packaged programs is that they don't have really treatment integrity checklists in terms of social skills interventions. They give you a number of lessons, but they don't really have treatment integrity. So what we've done in some cases is build our own treatment integrity checklist to match in terms of what the intervention would be. The goal really would be also to make sure that the interventions are efficient, because in some cases, if they're not efficient, obviously teachers won't do them. Database decision making is really important, particularly if we're going to look at matching the intervention to function student need. And in terms of setting up our goals so that the student can contact reinforcement, it's looking for ambitious yet attainable goals. So one of the questions would be the treatment integrity checklist for common Tier 2 interventions that are publicly available. Yeah, we can. If you send me an email, I can look at in terms of trying to come up with, put together all those integrity checklists for the different Tier 2 interventions that either we've created or other folks with the TA Center has created as well. Other questions? Okay. What is check and connect, as well as what is first step? And so why don't we take that next question? That's a great question. Well, check and connect was developed for basically for elementary students to assist in terms of improving attendance is one of the things, and then assist in terms of improving engagement. It's somewhat similar to check and checkout, and but it has more in depth in terms of actually mentoring. There's a mentoring component that's part of each student is assigned a mentor to help them in terms of navigating both the behavioral and academic environment. It's clearly an evidence-based program developed out of the University of Minnesota by the woman's name, by Christensen, and the first step is a program that would be for younger students, probably first graders, second graders, that also looks at in terms of proactive monitoring, and has a gating procedure that looks similar to what we would have for identifying students that need supports, and then has self-monitoring, teaches the student self-monitoring skills to be able to be more successful in the classroom. How extensive does your request for assistance need to be? I would make it as easy as possible for teachers, but one way in terms of that tool that I presented, it just asks the teachers to list their top 10 individuals who have a problem behavior, whether it's internalizes or externalizes. It allows the teachers to check off in terms of whether it's an internalizer or an externalizer. And then from there, it looks at in terms of some reminders in terms of the teachers actually teaching the expectations and reinforcing the expectations. It would be as simple as you can, but you clearly want to ask the teacher to be able to identify what the problem area is. Can they identify what the functions were? Since some folks basically automatically use the facts with the referral for Tier 2 interventions. So Laura's come up with a resource for check and connect, which is cool. Thank you, Laura. Nice job. Another question is from Kathleen. When a student doesn't want to give the daily sheet to the teacher, are there next steps to try? Well, one of the things I would do is look at in terms of what the function is in terms of the behavior. Obviously, you'd want to have a discussion with the student in terms of why they don't want to give the daily point sheet. Is it because they had a bad day and that they don't want to share that with the individual who's the checkout person? One of the things we do is try to reinforce just people turning in the daily sheet, whether they've had a good day or a bad day. So we're looking at some reinforcer for everybody for just turning it in, and particularly around those individuals who there may be some resistance in terms of turning the daily sheet in. The other thing we'll be looking at in terms of what are the reinforcers for the individuals, and this is where I'd look at doing a preference assessment so you could figure out where with the individual student what might be the preferred items for them. All right, great. Kendra has any ideas for implementing check-in, check-out, and secondary and managing schedules, and numerous teachers often the students are embarrassed to walk with the form. You're right in terms of that's a challenge for individuals. There was a presentation in the recently at PBIS that was on check-in, check-out in terms of secondary schools, which is probably worthwhile to go if you don't have access to the PBIS website, then or the presentations there, then let me know. I can see if I can track that down for you. If rather than kind of walking with the form, if you can make it part of a tablet is another kind of a suggestion in terms of using. But the goal of check and check out would be in terms of students going across their daily schedule and turning in their form to the teacher to have the teacher check. So it's worked reasonably well in terms of secondary schools. You really have to be obviously sensitive to the students' need for privacy if they're going to be embarrassed by walking with forms. So one might be to kind of just hide it in some way inside a book or whatever, so they're not just kind of walking around with the form and feeling like they're embarrassed. Other questions? So Kathleen has another question is, if a student moves to Tier 3, do you discontinue check-in, check-out? My suggestion is when you're building your Tier 3, you want to have access to all your Tier 2 interventions, because in some cases what you want to do is you may want to layer your Tier 2 interventions, so they need both social skills, programming, they might need the check-in, check-out. So I wouldn't discontinue it. Particularly if you just want to use the data system in terms of check-in, check-out, I would certainly probably continue with check-in. You probably want to modify it to more on an individual basis than the standardized check-in, check-out. But in most cases, we continue with the check-in, check-out as we move students to Tier 3. Well, thank you very much for your attention, and hopefully this was helpful. If you want to email me, my email is bputnam@mayinstitute.org, bputnam@mayinstitute.org, and I'd be more than willing to answer any other questions that come up. Thanks again. Next month's webinar would be what building teams should ask of their districts, by Steve Goodwin. Steve's a great speaker, so that it would be worthwhile if you're on a building team to attend that webinar. So thanks again. Enjoy your spring. We'll catch up with you later.